The first chalk line on the board was already wrong, and it wasn't by accident. The clock on the lecture hall wall clicked with a quiet stiffness, each second striking the back of time like a chisel on stone. Outside the wide windows, October wind toyed with the brittle maples, sending down leaves like paper letters written by autumn itself. Inside, 32 advanced mathematics students sat motionless, not out of fascination, but out of expectation. In the back row, a boy with dark brown hair and ears still red from the cold clutched a tattered notebook held together with tape. That was James Drew, son of an oat farmer from Clay County, a place you'd have to zoom in 3 times on a U.S. map to even find. He wore a faded brown jacket, his shoulders slightly hunched as though he hadn't quite grown into his height yet. His shoes were cracked leather, heels worn thin enough to feel the floor tiles beneath them, and in his eyes, there was the light of someone who had once read by the dim lantern in a barn, because the house couldn't spare enough light. Standing at the front was Professor Halden Crow, a man whose name in mathematical circles at Cornell carried the weight of an institution. Tall, thin, rigid as a straightedge, Crow had long been dubbed the last gatekeeper of pure logic. But there was something in his eyes today. Not just reason, perhaps anticipation, perhaps disdain, perhaps design. He lifted a stick of chalk, clean, white, sharp-edged, and brought it to the slate-black board that covered half the wall. The chalk made a dry squeak, like a door closing on the past. All eyes followed the line. Arcs, sharp corners, symbols, sigmas, double integrals, constraint conditions. No one spoke, but everyone knew. This wasn't a real problem. Crow stepped back, head tilted, as if admiring a piece of abstract art. The chalk line bent oddly, a crooked river veering off the map. And even at a glance, the initial condition contradicted the domain of definition. The first chalk line was already wrong, and it wasn't by accident. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crow said, his voice metallic and even, "this will serve as the opening problem for the term. Who would like to try?" Silence. A student in the front row peeked at his neighbor, lips pressed thin. A few others smirked, half admiring, half gleeful. This wasn't the stillness of fear. It was the silence before a public intellectual hanging. And the target, the sacrifice, was obvious. James Drew. The boy from nowhere. The janitor's helper. The one who, it was whispered, once used fireplace ash to write equations on the barn wall because he had no chalkboard. Crow turned toward him, not smiling, not frowning, just the cold gaze of a man absolutely certain of his trap. "Mr. Drew," he said, "I've heard you solved non-linear partial differential equations with only old county library books. Would you like to try this one?" A ripple ran through the class like a sudden breeze under the door. James looked up, didn't speak. He stared at the board. No pen, no notebook. And in his eyes was not fear, but the stillness of someone long acquainted with being underestimated. The night before, the campus had been windless. No moon, just the long, slow toll of a chapel bell far off, beyond the trees that rimmed the cemetery. James lay on the top bunk of the dormitory bed, paging through old notes, yellowed copies of copies, taken from books 4 counties away. His father once said, "If you can't lift the world with your hands, son, learn to shift it with your mind." That voice rang again now, deep and worn, like gospel etched into wood. That morning, James had walked from his dorm through a heavy fog that clung to the stone arches of Cornell's Gothic buildings. Past the granite benches, past the faint silhouette of the Ezra Cornell statue, toward this very hall, carrying nothing more than a faded coat and a quiet belief that even mockery couldn't take away what he knew. Crow dabbed chalk dust from his fingers with a handkerchief, each gesture precise, as if to say, "The stage is yours, if you dare." Then he stepped aside. "Any takers?" he asked again. "Or shall I choose?" No one raised a hand. But as the second hand of the clock twitched forward, James slowly rose from his seat. Deliberate, not fast, not shaky, every eye followed him, as if ropes of expectation had been fastened to his shoulders, pulling him toward a scaffold of logic. Crow smiled faintly, a crack barely visible across the ice, but to the attentive it was clear. This was the moment he'd been waiting for all month. James reached the board. He didn't touch the chalk, didn't fix his hair, didn't look back. He just stood there. 1 minute, 2, 3. The silence thickened, until you could hear the quietest sound, a girl swallowing nervously in the front row. James tilted his head. He lifted a hand and gently traced a symbol with his finger, a third-degree integral. Then, suddenly, he pulled his hand back. He had seen it. The trap. Not in the integral, not in the Newman condition, but in a non-differentiable continuous function embedded in the initial boundary, a function whose very inclusion created a contradiction by step 4 of any valid solution path. James stepped back. Didn't write. Didn't speak. He just said, softly, a voice barely above the dust in the air, "The first line is wrong." It started as a whisper in the hallway, dry as chalk dust, carried on the breath of disbelief. Crow set him up. It wasn't even solvable. That equation was a decoy. He wasn't supposed to solve it. He was supposed to fail. By mid-afternoon, the whispers had become wind. They moved through Cornell's stone corridors, slipped under the oak doors of faculty offices, clung to the walls of the mathematics lounge like frost. Somewhere between the Olin library stacks and the icy bridges over Fall Creek, the story began to take form. James Drew hadn't tried to solve the problem. He had dismantled it. He hadn't reached for the chalk. He hadn't asked for time. He hadn't touched a single equation. He had simply said, "The first line is wrong." And then he'd sat down. That sentence, quiet, unarmed, almost soft, struck harder than any proof ever scribbled on a blackboard. Inside the dorms, the air was heavier than usual. Those who had been in the lecture hall now became storytellers, each with their own angle. "Crow was waiting for him to fail," said Victor Lane, a junior who always sat 2 rows from the front. "The guy smiled when James stood up, like it was all part of the game." "A trap," said Mira Chowdhury, eyes narrowed behind thick glasses. "It was a trap dressed as a theorem." In room 4B, someone pulled up an archived PDF from Crow's previous lectures. The pattern became clear. Every semester, on the first day of advanced logic and analysis, Crow posed a problem that no one could answer. But this time, someone had refused to play. And not just anyone. The farm boy. The janitor's son. The quiet one. Meanwhile, James sat on the edge of his narrow bed, the old notebook open in his lap. The room was cold. A steam pipe in the wall ticked intermittently, as if reminding him that winter was never far in Ithaca. His desk was bare except for a mug with chipped enamel, half full of weak coffee, and a small paper bag of roasted chestnuts he'd brought back from the commons. He'd skipped lunch. His stomach had learned the shape of hunger a long time ago. James flipped to the back of the notebook, to the last few blank pages. He didn't write equations. Not yet. He began instead to draw a map, not of places, but of assumptions. On one side he wrote, "Domain conflicts." Below that, Non-differentiable boundary conditions, improper constraints, false convergence in iterative space. On the opposite page, he began sketching what looked like layered shells, concentric rings, each representing a layer of constraint collapse. This wasn't a solution, not exactly. It was a new way of seeing the absence of solutions. Somewhere between logic and topology, James was inventing a new frame, one that allowed space to breathe around contradictions rather than collapse beneath them. The knock on the door came just after sundown. 3 slow taps. James closed the notebook and slid it under his pillow before answering. Standing in the hall was Sasha Ravel, a third-year student in mathematical physics. Her hair was tied back, coat half-buttoned, hands in her pockets, but her eyes were sharp. She had been at the front of the lecture that morning. "I wasn't going to come," she said without greeting, "but I can't stop thinking about what you said." James said nothing. He stepped aside. Sasha entered slowly, as if unsure whether she'd just crossed into a quiet room or a battlefield. "I stayed after class," she said, pacing. Crow wiped the board clean before anyone else could look at it, just erased it, like it never happened. James's brow twitched, but he still said nothing. "So I tried to reconstruct it from memory," Sasha continued. "But I couldn't. Not all of it. Just fragments. The structure was deliberately flawed, like an optical illusion, but made out of variables. The domain condition. Was it the 4th line?" James finally spoke. "It was the first," he said softly. "The moment the initial constraint contradicts the function's continuity, the rest is decoration." Sasha blinked. "So, you saw it right away?" James nodded. "I've seen problems like it before. Not in class, back home. When things break on the farm, the mistake is never where the noise is. It's where the pressure starts." Sasha sat down slowly. She studied him now, really studied him. Not as a curiosity, not as a rumor, but as someone who had seen something she hadn't. "You didn't try to fix it," she said. "You just refused to play." "I don't think it was ever a game," James said. "At least not for me." A pause. Then Sasha leaned forward. "James, do you think he knew it was unsolvable?" James met her gaze. "I think Professor Crow knew exactly what he was doing." Later that night, when Sasha left and the hallway had gone still again, James opened the notebook once more. He began writing this time. Not solutions, but questions. At the top of the page, in small, careful letters, he wrote, "What if problems that collapse aren't mistakes, but messages?" And below that, a line he underlined twice. "The absence of solution can be its own form of symmetry." Outside, the wind picked up again. Inside, James's pencil moved slowly, carefully, like a man tracing the edges of something the world had tried to hide. It was Wednesday morning, 2 days after the chalk. The sun never quite rose in Ithaca that day, just a pale light straining through thick clouds, as if the sky had forgotten how to commit to brightness. In the corridors of Goldwyn Smith Hall, the buzz hadn't died down. If anything, it had sharpened into something more dangerous than curiosity. Now, it was expectation. Inside Lecture Hall 6A, every seat was filled. More than enrolled students, more than the syllabus allowed. Some had heard from friends. Others came out of rumor, or revenge, or quiet allegiance. There was a pressure in the air, a feeling students rarely knew but professors recognized instantly. The class was no longer about learning. It had become a stage. Professor Halden Crow entered at exactly 9 o'clock a.m. No smile, no notes, no greetings. He walked straight to the blackboard. There was something different in his posture today. No longer the quiet control of an ivory tower sentinel. Now, his movements were more deliberate, more like a man preparing for a duel, not with swords, but with symbols. Without a word, he picked up a piece of chalk. Not a fresh one this time. This one had already been used. Worn at the edge. That, too, was a message. He began writing. Slowly. One symbol at a time. No rushing. A system of constraints. An integral boundary. A nested domain. Again, the same architecture from Monday. The unsolvable equation. But this time it came with something new. At the top of the board he wrote, "Let P be the given problem. Prove P has no solution under its given constraints." The students froze. It wasn't a trap anymore. It was a challenge. James sat in the back, his hands folded, notebook closed. He didn't flinch, didn't lean forward, but his breath slowed. This wasn't about solving anything. This was about making him defend what he hadn't even claimed. Crow turned to face the class. "Someone once said this problem was flawed," he began, his voice sharp as frost. "And perhaps it is. But if so, then where exactly does it break?" Silence. His eyes scanned the room. "This is no longer about cleverness. It's about clarity." He paused. "And clarity must be earned." No one moved. Then, slowly, a hand rose from the second row. Caleb Lynn, a meticulous sophomore known for his rigor, not his courage. "Yes, Mr. Lynn?" Crow said. Caleb cleared his throat. "The initial constraint contradicts the continuity of the second condition," he began. "So—" "Show me," Crow interrupted. "On the board." Caleb stood, walked up nervously, took the chalk. He pointed to the line just below the first constraint. "If the function is continuous in the closed domain D," he said, "but the constraint requires discontinuity at the interior boundary, then the contradiction arises here." Crow stepped forward. "And you are certain this is where it collapses?" I think so. Yes." Crow turned to the class. "That is one interpretation," he said flatly. "But there is another." He erased Caleb's line. Then, looking directly to the back row, he asked, "Mr. Drew, would you care to explain your interpretation?" Every head turned. James didn't move. For a moment it seemed he might not respond at all. Then, he stood. Slowly. No showmanship. He walked to the front of the room, every step echoing off the stone walls like a drumbeat from the past. Crow handed him the chalk. James held it gently, like something once alive. He didn't begin by writing. He looked at the board, then turned to the class, and said simply, "The problem isn't that it collapses. It's that it pretends not to." There was a murmur, part confusion, part curiosity. James pointed to the very first line. "The initial constraint is written as if it were self-contained, but it secretly depends on an external condition, one not listed in the problem." He drew a faint arrow from the first condition to the boundary assumption 3 lines down. "Here," he said, "the variable space collapses unless the solution set is reparameterized. But that only works if you assume continuity where the constraint actually forbids it." Crow narrowed his eyes. James continued. "You could try to build around the contradiction with substitution or exception sets, but it's like building a bridge on a fold in the map." He put the chalk down. "I didn't solve the problem," James said. "I just refused to walk across a bridge that wasn't there." For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone clapped. Once, then twice. Then the room slowly, almost awkwardly, filled with the sound of hesitant applause. Not thunderous, not cinematic, but real, uneasy, divided. Crow didn't move. His face was stone. He let the noise rise, then fall. Then he said, So, the boy who won't solve problems has come to teach us how to avoid them. There was tension in the voice. Not anger, not sarcasm, something else. Something almost shaken. Later that day, two professors in the faculty lounge were whispering over coffee. You saw what he did, right? With no equations. And Crow, did you hear his voice? That wasn't dismissal. That was fear. James didn't return to his dorm immediately. He walked, through the cold paths between buildings, across the quiet footbridge over Cascadilla Creek, past the frost on the ivy-covered arches. He sat on a bench near the observatory, notebook in lap, and began writing again. This time he titled the page, Assumptions as Fault Lines. Underneath, a single line. Some systems collapse not from error, but from dishonesty in their foundations. He didn't sign it. But across campus, that phrase would soon appear on a whiteboard outside the graduate math lounge. No one knew who wrote it. But many began to suspect the boy from nowhere wasn't just passing through. He had started something. It happened on a Thursday, a gray-skied, fog-heavy afternoon where the wind scraped like bone against the stone facades of Cornell's older buildings. The seminar room in Rockefeller Hall was warm, lit only by two wall sconces and the soft glow of a floor lamp near the window. A graduate-level seminar in applied logic and nonlinear dynamics was just beginning. There were only 12 students, all doctoral candidates. James Drew was not on the roster. He shouldn't have been in the room. But as fate would have it, or perhaps something more deliberate, James was sitting silently in the far back, invited by a doctoral student named Lucien Park, who had quietly admired his clarity in Professor Crow's lecture. Lucien had said, half-jokingly, "You might find our sessions dull after what you did Monday, but Crow doesn't teach this one, so at least you'll be safe from the cold." James had smiled politely. He came for the math. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that Crow had been there just hours earlier, handing the guest lecturer a sealed envelope. Inside was a problem set, with a single quiet instruction. Use the first one. Don't tell them where it came from. The lecturer, Dr. Marilyn Dorsey, was respected for her elegance in abstraction. Former student of Crow, now tenured. She was not cruel, not political, but also not curious. She saw the equation and, trusting the source, simply wrote it on the board. No attribution, no context, no warning. But when James looked up and saw the problem, his heart stopped. Not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. Too well. It was almost identical to Monday's problem, but not quite. This time, the deception was buried deeper. A disguised mapping function, a boundary masked as a free variable, and a new constraint that seemed benign, but quietly reversed the logic of the entire system. It looked solvable. It begged to be solved. But James could see the trap inside the trap. Around him, the graduate students began scribbling. Dorsey gave them 30 minutes to try. Some worked in silence. Others whispered. James didn't move. Lucien, sitting beside him, glanced over. "Something wrong?" he asked. James's voice was low. "It's not her equation." Lucien frowned. "What?" James stared at the board, eyes narrowing. He buried the contradiction deeper this time. Same method. Different shell. 20 minutes in, the first murmurs of frustration began. "I can't isolate the variable space. The boundary collapses under second iteration. Are we missing a definition set?" Lucien put his pencil down. "This doesn't feel like Dr. Dorsey's usual style." Then, quietly, James stood up and walked to the board. He didn't ask permission. didn't explain. He picked up the chalk. In the margin of the problem, he drew a circle around the new constraint. Then, beneath it, he wrote 3 simple words: implicit dependency conflict. Dr. Dorsey blinked. James turned around and finally spoke. It's not solvable. Not under this structure. The constraint at line 5 creates a hidden dependency that violates the initial variable assumption. It looks like a free-floating condition, but it's actually recursive. It collapses when mapped into second-phase continuity. A pause. James looked directly at Dorsey, but what he meant was for someone else. Whoever wrote this didn't want it solved. They wanted us to miss the contradiction. The silence that followed was longer than polite. Finally, Dr. Dorsey stepped forward. She examined the board, slowly, carefully, then looked at James. "You've seen this before," she said quietly. Not a question, a statement. James nodded. Dorsey's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but realization. "I see," she whispered. "Crow." That night, the graduate students spread the word faster than any memo ever could. Crow had planted the problem, had tried again. This time, not to embarrass James in front of undergrads, but to invalidate him among the elite, to say, "You don't belong up here, stay in your place." And yet, once again, he had failed. But this time, something else had changed. James wasn't just that janitor kid who pointed out a contradiction. Now, he was the only one in the room who saw what even PhDs had missed. At 9:17 that evening, James received an email. Subject line: private appointment requested. From Halden Crow. No greeting, no sign-off. Just a time and location. Friday, 4:00 p.m. Office 3B, White Tower. No explanation. Just a place. The same tower where graduate defenses were held. The same place Crow hadn't summoned a student in 7 years. James stared at the screen. Not surprised, not afraid. He closed the laptop, then opened his notebook, and began sketching again. On the page, he drew a spiral. Not of failure, of recursion. Systems that loop back not to repeat, but to evolve. At the center, he wrote, "The deeper the deception, the more elegant the unraveling." Beneath it, smaller, "I don't solve problems to prove I'm right. I solve them to prove they can't trap anyone else." White Tower stood slightly apart from the main academic quadrangle of Cornell. It wasn't the tallest building on campus, but it was the most silent. Few students ever climbed the narrow stone staircases. It housed nothing flashy. No freshman lectures, no cafeterias, no labs. Only offices and defenses. It was a place where scholars were either broken or built. On Friday at 4:00 p.m. sharp, James Drew walked through the heavy oak door of Office 3B. He did not knock. He stepped inside, quietly, like one steps into a library of ghosts. Professor Halden Crow stood by the window, arms crossed, looking out toward the gray sprawl of Ithaca, where the mist blurred the edges of the world. He did not turn when the door opened. "Sit," he said simply. James did not move to the chair. He stood. The air between them was thick with the unspoken. Crow finally turned, walked slowly to the large chalkboard that covered the east wall. His shoes echoed slightly on the hardwood floor, that sharp, deliberate rhythm of a man who had spent a lifetime walking only where he intended. He picked up the chalk. "Since you've already seen through the facade," he said, "let's see if you can build something in its place." James didn't answer. Crow turned, and for the first time his voice lowered, not as a threat, but as a test. "You exposed the flaw. Congratulations, but deconstruction is easy. Creation, Mr. Drew. That's the domain of masters. Then slowly, he began to write. But this time the board didn't fill with contradictions. What he wrote was clean, precise, structured, a foundation, a fragment, the opening to a real system. He stepped back. This, he said, is a bare frame. A problem that could be solvable, but it needs integrity. It needs internal consistency. If you're as clever as they say you are, he paused, then build it. Make the house stand. James finally stepped forward. Still no words. He examined the board, not just the math, but the intention beneath it. It wasn't a trap this time. It was a provocation, like a fencer dropping the sword and asking, "Can you forge one better?" Slowly, James picked up the chalk. He made no dramatic gestures, no flourish. He simply began. First, he revised the domain structure, mapping it not as a rectangle in R2, but as a nested manifold defined by variable tension. Then, he reframed the constraint, not as a hard border, but as a layered soft boundary that could bend under limit operations. Next, he altered the function from a closed form to a convergent series with recursive checkpoints, allowing failure to be measured and integrated without system collapse. It wasn't flashy. It was elegant. And above all, it held. Crow said nothing. He watched. Every line James added was like mortar between stones. Nothing wasted, nothing ornamental. In 15 minutes, James had not only restored structural integrity, he had introduced resilience. The system didn't just exist, it survived contradiction. Finally, James set the chalk down, then turned. Crow stared at the board. His mouth parted slightly, not in shock, but in something deeper. Recognition. He stepped forward. His eyes ran down the page, twice, 3 times. Then he said very softly, "This doesn't exist in literature." James simply nodded. "I call it the layered constraint method," he said. "It's not a solution. It's a framework for problems that aren't meant to hold still." Crow turned to him. For the first time, he truly looked at the boy, not as an intruder, not as an anomaly, but as something even rarer in academia, an origin point. And yet, he didn't say well done, didn't offer praise, didn't surrender. Crow stepped closer. His voice returned to that old steel. "And do you think, James, that rewriting a framework gives you ownership of the house?" James met his gaze. "No," he said. "It gives me a key." Silence. Outside, the wind rattled the window. Inside, for the briefest moment, Crow looked tired. Not old, not weak. Just a man standing at the edge of something he could not define. "I tried to shake you," he said quietly. James didn't reply. "I designed that problem to be a mirror, to reflect failure back at the one who stepped forward. But you didn't attack it. You unbuilt it." James said calmly, "It was already cracked. I just didn't pretend it was art." Crow turned away, stared again out the window. Then, almost inaudibly, "They're going to come after you." James frowned. "Who?" Crow didn't answer. Not directly. He just said, "This school tolerates brilliance, but it doesn't forgive disruption." Then he faced James one last time. "I don't like being wrong," he said, "but I despise being outpaced." A pause. "And you're not finished yet." James nodded. "I never wanted to win," he said. "I wanted to understand." And with that, he turned and walked out of the office. No handshake, no final word, just footsteps, fading down the stairs of White Tower. In the hallway outside, James paused, took out his notebook. On the next blank page, he wrote, Some problems aren't about finding the answer. They're about exposing who built the wrong question. And below it, smaller. Quiet doesn't mean weak. It means listening to what the math won't say out loud. He closed the book and kept walking. The email came late Saturday night from a sender James didn't recognize, Dr. R. Ellman. Subject: request for private consultation regarding your recent framework. Tone: polite, direct, curious. He claimed to be a visiting researcher from École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Said he had read a brief transcript of James's Blackboard proof, the one Crow had quietly circulated among a closed faculty loop. He requested only 30 minutes. To discuss the implications of what you've constructed. James didn't reply right away. Something about the message felt too clean. But the man had attached credentials, university seal, publishing record, even an abstract in French on constraint fluidity and mathematical topology, a field that, strangely, mirrored what James was starting to sketch on his own. Sunday afternoon, they met in the old math library, the one buried under Uris Hall, where the ceilings were low and the dust smelled like the 1800s. Dr. Ellman looked exactly like the kind of man who didn't want to be remembered. Neatly trimmed beard, thin wire glasses, accent faint, not Parisian, but something older, harder to place. Perhaps Eastern France, perhaps somewhere else entirely. He didn't smile, didn't shake hands, only sat down at the long oak table and folded his fingers over a plain black notebook. "I've reviewed your notes," he began. James frowned. "How did you get my notes?" Ellman didn't flinch. They weren't hard to find. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Then Ellman spoke again, softer this time. "Tell me, James, when you built your layered constraint method, did you believe you were the first?" James hesitated. "I didn't think about it." Ellman's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something quieter. Pity. "You should have." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded photocopy, laid it on the table. James leaned in. It was a fragment. A page torn from a much older paper, yellowed, handwritten, French notations mixing with dense mathematical symbols. The handwriting was elegant but urgent. At the top, faded but legible, Méthode des contraintes superposées, method of superposed constraints. James blinked. It wasn't exactly his method, but it was close. Too close. Identical structural assumptions, layered soft boundaries, variable decay curves based on shifting domain logic. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a predecessor. "Who wrote this?" James asked, voice tight. Ellman tapped the page. "Unknown. The signature was cut from the archive." "Where did you find it?" "A restricted drawer in the Bibliothèque Nationale, marked as incomplete research, rejected 1962. No publication. No citation. Buried." James looked down again. His fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, but something worse. Recognition. "You're not the first to find it," Ellman said, "but you might be the first to survive showing it." James looked up and suddenly understood what this meeting was really about. Not mentorship, not collaboration. Warning. Ellman leaned closer. "There are frameworks," he said softly, "that don't just threaten academic convention. They threaten intellectual lineage. If your method stands, it will unseat papers, dismantle careers, challenge entire schools of thought." He paused. And Crow knew. James narrowed his eyes. "You're saying he's seen this before?" Ellman nodded. "He buried it, along with the man who found it." The room seemed colder now, the lights too dim. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, soft but insistent. James felt the weight of something pressing against the walls of his chest, a kind of grief for something he hadn't yet lost. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Elman's face hardened. "Because I didn't speak up 50 years ago, and it cost a man his name." He pushed the fragment across the table. "It's yours now, but be careful. Not everyone wants truth rediscovered." Then he stood, buttoned his coat, and vanished into the stairwell. James sat in the quiet, alone with a copy of a method nearly identical to his own. A method that never saw the light of day. A method that had been, for all intents and purposes, erased from history. That night, he couldn't sleep. He opened his notebook, flipped past the pages of equations and sketches until he reached a fresh one. At the top, he wrote, "To build something real, I have to uncover what was buried." Below it, he began listing names. Mathematicians from the 1960s, French institutions, articles withdrawn, dissertations lost. Anyone who might have written the fragment. It was the first time James realized this journey wasn't just academic anymore. It was archaeology. On Monday morning, Professor Crow passed him in the hallway. They didn't speak, but as they crossed paths, James turned and said quietly, "Did you know about Elman?" Crow stopped. His face was unreadable. "I know many things," he said. "But you buried this method," James pressed. Crow met his gaze, and for the first time his voice held something cold and final. "Some truths do not belong to children." James stared at him, then said, calmly, "Then I guess it's time someone grew up fast." And he walked away. The snow came heavier that week. It lay in thick white sheets over the rooftops of Cornell, softening the sharp Gothic spires and covering the campus in a hush that felt almost sacred. Inside Olin Library, buried beneath the rows of journals and dust-heavy volumes, James Drew worked in silence. He had moved to a corner desk near the basement stacks, a space usually reserved for graduate students. No one questioned him. Not anymore. His table was littered with open books, pages marked in pencil, coffee gone cold. In the center was a yellow legal pad, half filled with tight, slanted handwriting and symbols that didn't yet exist in any textbook. James wasn't trying to defend his method anymore. He was rebuilding it, line by line, layer by layer, not as a footnote, but as a new framework of mathematics. No longer the layered constraint method. Now he called it cascading boundary logic. Where most systems assumed fixed conditions, his model assumed fluidity. Where boundaries were layered like sediment, shifting under pressure but never collapsing all at once. Where others failed in contradiction, his transformed failure into structure. He wasn't offering an answer to an old problem. He was offering a new language to describe the unsolvable. Crow hadn't spoken to him since the hallway exchange. But James could feel it. The weight of his presence in every chalkboard, every narrowed glance from senior students, every moment of silence when he entered a room. And yet, something else had shifted too. He was no longer alone. One by one, students began to drift toward his desk. Meera Chowdhury, the logicist who had once mocked him, now sat across from him after class. "I don't fully get the layered decay model," she admitted, "but the way you used recursive shells to map collapse points, I've never seen anything like it." James just handed her the pad. "Take a look, I need someone to break it." Victor Lane brought coffee and quietly asked if he could help typeset the latex. Lucien Park offered to write a software simulator to test James's recursive models in 3 dimensions. They didn't ask to co-author. They didn't ask to lead. They just wanted to help him build. And James, for the first time, let them. 3 weeks in, the draft took form, cascading boundary logic, a framework for constraint tolerance and recursive structural adaptation. It wasn't flashy. It didn't promise to solve millennium problems, but it offered something rarer, a way to navigate uncertainty without collapse, a way to live inside contradiction and not be destroyed by it. James read it aloud once, late at night, under a desk lamp with a busted shade. He didn't smile, but he underlined one line near the end. Where classical logic fails in tension, we propose a logic that absorbs it. And below that, in smaller handwriting, this paper is not about proof, it's about possibility. He submitted it quietly, not to Nature, not to Annals of Mathematics, but to a smaller journal known for publishing fringe logic theory, the International Journal of Mathematical Structures. He didn't attach a resume, didn't name his university, just signed it. James Drew, Clay County, Iowa. Word spread faster than he expected. Within a week, an assistant to Professor Margaret Ellison, chair of Applied Mathematical Theory, requested a private reading. She read it in a day, then sent back a single message. "Is this yours?" James replied, "Every line." She didn't respond. But 3 days later, he was invited to speak. It wasn't a public seminar, just a closed-door colloquium. 8 professors, 3 graduate advisors, 2 journal editors. He arrived with his backpack, notebook, and a small printout of his draft, stapled once in the corner. When he began to speak, his voice was quiet, measured, almost like reading aloud from a journal no one else had ever opened. But by the 10-minute mark, they were all listening. By 20 minutes, they were leaning forward. And by the end, they were silent. One professor finally asked, "Did you develop this purely through analysis?" James paused, then answered truthfully, "No. Through failure, and watching things fall apart on the farm." Another asked, "What school are you from?" James hesitated. "Cornell," he said softly. Unofficially. When he left the room, no one stopped him. But later that night, Professor Ellison emailed him personally. "This is the most original framework I've seen in a decade. I'll endorse the submission, but you must know, it will attract both attention and resistance. Be ready." James stared at the email for a long time, then closed the laptop and went back to work. In the weeks that followed, 2 professors privately asked to meet him. One offered to sponsor an independent study track. Another suggested graduate-level credit. A faculty council whispered about creating a new subfield course. Crow said nothing, but others were speaking now, and not all of them were kind. One afternoon, James found a copy of his draft shredded and stuffed in his campus mailbox. No note, just pieces. That night, he taped it back together on his dorm room wall, every jagged line visible. Above it, he pinned a handwritten quote, "Some truths come back sharper the second time." It began with a headline on the department bulletin board. "Open Colloquium, Emerging Frameworks in Constraint Logic," featuring James Drew. Moderator, Professor Halden Crow. Location, Lecture Hall West, Room 1001. Time, Thursday, 4:00 p.m. No fanfare, no invitation, just a time and place, and a signal that the university wasn't whispering anymore. James stared at the notice for a long time. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't planned on it. But as Mira, Lucien, and Victor read the announcement over his shoulder, they didn't look shocked, just steady. "Don't let him bait you," Mira said. "He won't argue the math," Lucien added. "He'll argue the right to define math." James nodded. He understood. This wasn't going to be about truth. It was going to be about authority. Thursday arrived colder than expected. Snow had begun to drift again, thin as powdered bone. Inside Lecture Hall West, the seats filled quickly. Not just students, but faculty, assistants, and even a few trustees. At the front of the room, 2 tables were set. On the left, Professor Halden Crow, spine straight, notes sealed in a leather folder. On the right, James Drew, no slides, no laptop, only a single notebook and a pencil. He didn't need anything else. He had the method. Crow stood first. His voice was soft, calculated. He didn't shout. He never shouted. Mathematics, he began, is not an act of imagination. It is an act of precision. To call something a logic does not make it one. A method must conform to foundational structures, not poetic metaphor, not narrative. He turned. Mr. Drew proposes a framework rooted in recursive soft boundaries, a term as undefined as it is unproven. He replaces clarity with ambiguity, rigidity with language borrowed from architecture and psychology. Some in the crowd nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. What James Drew offers, Crow concluded, is not mathematics. It is philosophy, dressed in the language of collapse. Then he sat. James stood. He didn't raise his voice either, but his first sentence cut through the silence like frost. Collapse is a language, you just haven't learned to read it. He paced slowly, not behind a podium, but in front of the board. He didn't refute Crow's points one by one. He did something riskier. He rewrote the room's center of gravity. Mathematics has always evolved at the edges of failure. Euclid never imagined non-Euclidean space. Hilbert couldn't resolve the infinite, and Gödel showed us truth has limits. He paused. I don't want to replace classical logic. I want to offer a structure for what happens when it breaks. Then he picked up a piece of chalk and wrote a simple recursive boundary function on the board. This isn't philosophy. It's algebra adapted to fragility. The room held its breath. Even Crow leaned forward, just slightly. He wasn't unmoved. He was calculating. Then a hand went up in the audience. Professor Ellison. Her voice was calm. Mr. Drew, what is the end goal of cascading boundary logic? James turned. To create frameworks that don't assume permanence, systems that shift without breaking. To teach students not just how to prove, but how to listen when proof falls silent. Ellison nodded once and said nothing more, but Crow stood again. This time his tone had changed. And who decides what qualifies as proof, Mr. Drew? James replied instantly. Not legacy, not tenure, the structure itself. Crow stepped closer. You speak as if institutions are the enemy. James shook his head. Not institutions. Fear. Fear of letting someone younger or quieter rebuild what was broken. Murmurs stirred in the room now. Some students nodded. Some faculty looked down. Others, notably 3 senior professors, crossed their arms. A fault line had opened, not between facts, but between eras. The debate ended not with victory, but with silence. Crow returned to his seat. James closed his notebook. The audience clapped, not thunderously, but divided. Later, in the hallway, someone whispered, "It wasn't a debate. It was a passing of something." Someone else replied, "Or a declaration of war." That night, back in the dorm, James found an envelope taped to his door. Inside, a torn page, handwritten, from 1961, in French. It was the second known page of the original Méthode des contraintes superposées. At the bottom, scrawled in unfamiliar English, "You are not alone, keep digging." James sat down, opened his notebook. On a clean page, he wrote, "Mathematics was never just about numbers. It was about what survives pressure." Then, beneath it, "The anger is not because I'm wrong, it's because I'm not supposed to be right." It began, as most revolutions do, with a leak. On Monday morning, a PDF circulated quietly through Cornell's internal server. No signature, no subject line, just a file titled Method Suppressed 1962.PDF. Within it, 2 scanned pages of handwritten notes, nearly identical to the core of James's framework. A short typed note stating that the pages were part of a rejected dissertation, filed under restricted access. A final line in bold. Resurfaced, authored by a student of Halden Crow. The department panicked. The dean of faculty issued a quiet internal memo by noon. All research pertaining to cascading boundary logic and related historical frameworks will be subject to immediate review. A formal committee will be assembled. James was not notified directly, but his name was on the agenda, and so was Crow's. By Wednesday, it was public. The Cornell Observer, the campus paper with usually modest readership, published a front-page story. Did a renowned professor bury a breakthrough? Allegations emerged that a 1960s framework, now resurfaced by undergraduate James Drew, was suppressed by former advisor Halden Crow. By noon, the headline had reached the Chronicle of Higher Education, and by nightfall, 3 retired faculty members had come forward to say, "Yes, we remember something like it." It was silenced. The Committee on Academic Ethics convened that Friday. James was called in first. The room was quiet. Mahogany table. 6 chairs occupied by faculty, most of them unfamiliar. One wore a gray scarf despite the heating. Another tapped his pen too often. No cameras, but every eye felt like a lens. "Mr. Drew," the chair began, "we want to make clear. You are not under investigation. You are here as a contributor and potentially a witness." James nodded once. No legal counsel, no professor at his side, just his notebook and the truth. They asked simple questions at first. When did you begin developing the method? Did anyone help you? Had you read the 1962 fragment before completing your draft? James answered clearly. No, I didn't see the French notes until after submission. Then they asked harder ones. Why do you think this method was never published? Do you believe Professor Crow knowingly suppressed it? James hesitated only once, then replied, I believe someone wanted it gone, and I believe Crow knew it existed. An hour later, Crow entered the same room. James passed him in the hallway. They didn't speak. But this time, James didn't look away. Crow did. Inside, the room took a different shape. Crow did not stutter, did not raise his voice. He arrived as a man cornered but not collapsed. He spoke in careful statements. I recall a student, yes. The work was preliminary. The mathematics lacked structural discipline. I did not suppress. I advised against premature publication. Then, when pressed, no, I do not recall the student's name. It was a small sentence, but it shattered the room, because the original 1962 file, just uncovered in archives, had been signed, though faintly, with a name, René Thibault, a student listed under Crow's mentorship between 1960 and 1963, a student who had vanished from publication records after 1964. On Sunday, a journalist from the Chronicle reached out to James. They had tracked down René's niece in Paris. He had died in 1982. Unknown. Unpublished. But in his belongings, she found A copy of his rejected dissertation letters never sent a final line in one of his journals. He said it would never be accepted, that it wasn't real math. I should have fought harder. By Monday morning, Cornell issued a formal statement. We will investigate the handling of unpublished work linked to former student René Thibault. We commend Mr. James Drew for his integrity and for bringing renewed attention to this body of research. They did not mention Crow by name, but they didn't have to. That afternoon, James returned to Lecture Hall West. Not to speak, just to sit. The board had been cleaned. The room was empty. But something had shifted. This was no longer someone else's institution. It was a place he had remade. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in restoration. Mira joined him a few minutes later. She sat beside him, quiet for a long time. Then finally asked, "Do you feel like you won?" James shook his head. "No," he said. "I feel like someone finally got heard." That night, in his dorm, James lit a single candle, a habit from home, for quiet work. He opened his notebook, turned to a blank page, and wrote, "Mathematics does not erase. People do." Then underneath, "But if the numbers are true, they will come back." Through anyone willing to listen, spring came late that year. The last snow clung to the rooftops like it had forgotten how to leave. Students walked the stone paths in lighter coats, and tulips bloomed cautiously along the base of Uris Hall. The scandal had faded from headlines, replaced by elections, conferences, and the endless churn of academic news. But one door did not open again. Professor Halden Crow's office, room 3B, White Tower, remained locked. No formal retirement ceremony, no farewell lecture, just an email from the dean. Professor Crow has chosen to step away from active instruction. And so he vanished. Not disgraced, just done. Meanwhile, in a different corner of the campus, James Drew was offered everything he never asked for: a full scholarship, a fast track into graduate research, a mentorship under Professor Ellison, even a named colloquium, the Drew Framework series on non-traditional logic. He thanked them all, then quietly declined. "You're walking away?" Mira asked. They were sitting by the bridge over Cascadilla Creek. The water had begun to run faster now, louder, like the world was thawing all at once. James nodded. "I came here to learn," he said. "Not to stay." Mira frowned. "And you think you've learned enough?" James didn't smile, but his voice softened. "I think there are kids out there like me, barn-raised, dust on their hands, chalk nowhere in sight. I think it's their turn." 3 weeks later, James packed everything he owned, which wasn't much, into a single duffel bag. The notebook stayed on him. He boarded the 520 Greyhound out of Ithaca, heading west, back toward Clay County, Iowa, back to a town with more corn silos than streetlights, back to a place where no one knew what cascading boundary logic meant, but everyone knew what it meant to fix something broken. That summer, in a vacant feed store on Main Street, James set up 6 desks, all second-hand, uneven legs. One was missing a drawer. He hung a chalkboard from an old fence post. Painted the front window himself. The open room. Math for anyone. No tuition. No formal curriculum. Just open hours, open questions, and one promise. If you want to learn, I'll sit with you until it makes sense. The first to walk in was a 12-year-old named Cal, son of a diesel mechanic, carried a notebook made from torn grocery bags. James taught him algebra using engine compression formulas. Next came Laney, 15, homeschooled, gifted at recognizing patterns in stitching. James taught her recursion using quilting patterns. By autumn, there were 9 students. By winter, 16. By the next spring, 32. One afternoon, a man in a worn suit arrived, a professor from a small college in Des Moines. He watched a lesson, quietly. Then after class, handed James a printed journal, the International Journal of Mathematical Structures, Volume 112, Issue 4. Cascading Boundary Logic, a New Paradigm for Adaptive Constraint Modeling. Author, James Drew. James ran his fingers across the cover, then set it aside. He had a lesson to finish. At the end of the day, James sat alone in the back of the room. The kids had gone. The light was soft. He opened his old notebook, wrote one last page. This isn't the end of a proof. It's the start of a place. Where failure is not a wall but a doorway. Where truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be listened to. He closed the book, looked at the board, still covered in chalk dust, and smiled. Not for himself, but for whoever would walk through that door next. Thank you for staying with us until the final page of this quiet story. In a world that moves too fast, it means more than words can say. That your heart made time for a boy who walked slowly, not to win, but to understand. James was never the kind of hero people write headlines about. He had no medals, no applause. But what he carried was something this world needs more than ever: a humility before knowledge, an honesty before failure, and the quiet courage to return home and plant something true. If this story touched something in you, then please remember, some truths don't need to be proven by applause, only by someone willing to listen. Thank you for listening. And if you can, tell this story to someone. To your grandson sketching rockets in the living room. To your daughter who doubts herself too often. Or maybe, just maybe, to a soul nearby that forgot it still matters.